Well, the time has just gone 8 o'clock, and a huge welcome to everyone around the world. It's such a great privilege on behalf of the South African Jewish Report to bring you our 119th webinar that we've run since lockdown began. And we were doing a calculation the other day about how many people have actually watched us in the 119 webinars that we've had. And we come to a figure of approximately 1.5 million views that we've been through since lockdown began. So it is really such a great privilege not only to bring you the webinar, but to reinvent what community looks like, breaking down borders of countries, of cities, being able to gather people and experts from around the world in order to have these important discussions that we're doing, for example, tonight. So I'm going to ask everyone to quickly turn off their cameras for a moment as we do our usual housekeeping. I'm going to ask Danny and Britt to turn on their cameras. Danny and Britt are on control this evening, and we'd love you guys to say hello. Danny, thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you so much. You guys are going to be monitoring the chat section. So if people are watching us on YouTube or Zoom or on Facebook, all they have to do if they're on Zoom is use either the chat functionality or the Q&A and make sure that this is a conversation, not a dialogue. And if you're watching on Facebook, or alternatively, if you're watching on YouTube, please use the comment section, and Danny and Britt will bring your comments across and we can continue that conversation here tonight. Cool, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just a reminder, the latest edition of the South African Jewish Report is out, Britt. It is 52 pages big of the Jewish Report. It's our Rosh Hashanah edition. It looks absolutely magnificent. Some amazing stories in that tonight. Please go and pick up your latest copy of the Jewish Report. You'll find it at CNA and Exclusive Books and your garage shop and your local restaurant, your synagogue, your school, your garage shop, your spa, Checkers, Pick and Pay. We're all over the place in about 240 locations around the country. So please go and pick up your latest edition of the Jewish Report. And you can also go and download the entire edition on www.sajr.co.za. And don't forget, while you're doing it, nominations for Jewish Achiever Awards close tomorrow, 5 p.m. There is no acceptance of any more nominations after 5 o'clock tomorrow. So if you would like to nominate someone, and I think when last I checked, we were on about 400 nominations for this year. If you would like to nominate someone, you've got to go till 5 p.m. tomorrow. Go on to the Jewish Report's homepage, www.sajr.co.za. You can nominate there. Or alternatively, you can send an email to nominations@sajreport.co.za. And although we're heading into the Yom Tov period, this isn't our last webinar. When Saturday night, we're in fact having an international Rosh Hashanah celebration with people and communities from around the world. And I just want to tell you, not only is there music and song and davening, and not only do we have people like Mary sending us messages and the chief rabbi and the Hebrew Kadisha and Atzola, but we've got the president of Israel has sent us a message. We've got greetings from Costa Rica and Panama and Australia and people all over the world. The Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish organizations has sent us a message. We are joining communities around the world, far-flung communities from Asia, from South America, from North America and Europe. We're joining as a world community in order to bring in the Jewish New Year to celebrate Rosh Hashanah, which starts on Monday evening. So please join us for an evening of music and song and thought and greetings, a really good, feel-good evening on Saturday evening, 8 o'clock. And you can go register, please, on Bitly, our Bitly link, SAJR Web, and that is going to be 119. Oh, so we're actually 118 today, not 119 today. So go register on SAJR Web 119. So that really concludes our introductory remarks, but we've got such an amazing panel this evening that we want to kind of dive in straight away and talk about a really important topic. Because 20 years ago this week, many of the people on the panel were in Durban experiencing the United Nations Conference Against Racism. And we want to talk about that conference and how it all went wrong. So I'd like to welcome the most illustrious panel that anyone has ever gathered on Zoom. And I would like Professor Erwin Kotler and Felice Gower to please turn on their cameras. Welcome to both of you. Owen, I think you're a household name to many in South Africa. You were former Minister of Justice of Canada, Attorney General of Canada as well. You now hold a very important position in terms of anti-Semitism and Holocaust memory within Canada itself. And Felice, not only are you involved in human rights work, but you were in fact involved in torture. I don't mean involved in torture, involved in the combating of torture as well. Remarkable, illustrious and deep human rights records that both of you have. So Owen, let's start with you. What was Durban supposed to be? What happened in 2001 and what was the United Nations hoping to achieve?
Well, first, let me say I'm delighted to be here with my colleague and good friend Felice, and we were both together at Durban. Let me say, when I first heard, and it was in 1997, that there was going to be a World Conference Against Racism in 2001 in Durban, South Africa, I greeted it with anticipation, if not excitement. This was to be the first World Conference Against Racism of the 21st century. Indeed, this was to be the first Conference of International Human Rights of the 21st century, with anti-racism as an organizing theme. And it was to take place in Durban, South Africa, which had been the birthplace of South African apartheid, and we would be able to commemorate the dismantling of South African apartheid. But what happened at Durban, and I say this as someone who's there in two capacities, both as a member of the Canadian delegation at Durban, but also participated in the NGO forum. What happened at Durban, if I can use an oft-abused metaphor, was truly Orwellian. A conference that was to be, as I said, a conference against racism and discrimination turned into a conference of hatred and racism against Israel and the Jewish people. A conference that was to be engaged in the promotion and protection of human rights, singled out one state and one people, Israel and the Jewish people, for selective opprobrium and indictment, and indeed characterized Israel and the Jewish people as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil. And a conference that was to celebrate the dismantling of South African apartheid ended up calling, and in fact began with, the calling for the dismantling of Israeli apartheid. And I have to tell you, Howard, as we're meeting, I can still, see the marches in the streets. I can still hear the chants, and the chanting would go on that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of Israel, of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. And I'll just close by saying that I flew back from South Africa to Montreal. I landed on the eve of 9/11. And I recall right after 9/11, one of my colleagues at Durban, with whom I'd been in touch with, said to me that if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, Durban was the Mein Kampf. In a word, Durban was the tipping point for the old new anti-Semitism.
So Felice, maybe we can begin almost a little earlier. Let's talk about 1975. That's when the United Nations declares Zionism to be racism. And then a battle ensues for the next 20 years almost, as the United Nations then rescinds this decision. But there are people who are unhappy with the fact that the ability to target Israel with this almost blood libel has suddenly disappeared. And now they must find their next tack and their next way of attack.
Well, first of all, Howard, thank you again for inviting me. And I too am delighted to be here with Erwin. I remember Erwin going around with his long pad of paper in Durban from one thing to another at the NGO conference, saying this too, oh my goodness, and writing it all down. And he brings important firsthand witness to all of what happened. Look, the United Nations became a vehicle for hatred, for spreading hatred, not just about Israel, but about the Jewish people. The idea that Zionism, the self-determination movement of the Jewish people, was a form of racism, racism being the ultimate evil, and certainly in the context of the United Nations, which was admitting states that had emerged from colonial periods into it, the idea that they had been able to denounce them in this way was a horrible crime. And the Secretary General of the UN in 1997, 98, and 2001, when the conference took place, Kofi Annan, he said as much. He called it the low point in the UN's history of relations with the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And it most certainly was. He was also the first UN Secretary General to even use the word Holocaust, because the Soviet Union had prevented that term from ever being used. You could only refer to the World War II and the depredations that resulted from that. Kofi Annan was married to the niece of Raoul Wallenberg, the famed Holocaust hero, and who Irwin's Institute is in fact named in honor of. And it was a period when the conference was announced in December 1997. It was a time that things looked up. Things were looking up. We had just had a period of UN World Conferences in the 1990s, the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, the World Conference on Women in Beijing. These were positive events. These were human rights events that brought new ideas, new actors, new institutions, new money, new commitments from governments into the world of policy and into promoting human rights for all. There was the hope that the Durban conference could do the same for the anti-racism issue. After all, we were right after Bosnia and Rwanda. We had seen some of the worst kinds of current depredations, and we supposedly thought we had learned from it. What we discovered at the time was that the Durban conference had been hijacked by a political group that did it explicitly to promote solidarity with the Palestinians. There are articles that have been written by South African leaders of different organizations, including Muslim organizations, saying as much. And they proceeded to promote division, disruption, distortion, and then after it was all over, denial that any of this had happened, denial that this was anti-Semitic. Yet it was all deliberate and it was all planned. What we saw was a political agenda that instrumentalized human rights and instrumentalized the anti-discrimination agenda, and frankly, instrumentalized the human rights movement for political and ideological purposes. These took over and no one stood up to it. And we ended up seeing anti-Semitism on display in Durban in a way that was shocking to all of us. And there was really what you, those of you who remember the 1954 book by William Golding, The Lord of the Flies, might think this is a good analogy. I do. We saw the breakdown of civilization. We saw groupthink, anti-rationality, immorality, and a descent into something akin to the savagery of Lord of the Flies in the context of that conference.
Felice, in what capacity were you actually there?
I was there as a non-governmental organization representative representing AJC's Jacob Blaustein Institute. But I had been a public member of US delegations to both Vienna and Beijing, and I had recently been elected as a expert member of the UN treaty monitoring body, the Committee Against Torture. So I had a kind of dual role in sort of keeping an eye on things for the Committee Against Torture, which is an independent entity. But I was there in my JBI capacity, my AJC JBI capacity.
So, Erwin, you were part of the Canadian delegation that was there. Was there any inkling before you went that the conference would in fact be hijacked?
No, I don't think we, as I said, I greeted it, and against the background of what Felice said, the announcement of this World Conference Against Racism with incitement and anticipation. I think we did not anticipate what would happen because, who could anticipate a kind of Lord of the Flies event? And I think Felice's metaphor was very exact, and particularly that it would take place in the NGO forum, because those of us who have been involved in the NGO forum regarded the NGO framework as being a framework for the promotion and protection of human rights, not for one, as Felice said, that would be instrumentalizing human rights and thereby undermining. I didn't mention, but Felice brought it to mind, and I remember witnessing, posters and pamphlets which said, "Too bad Hitler didn't finish the job." I remember seeing demonstrations with such posters and pamphlets. I remember seeing young students being bullied and assaulted. I remember being given copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I mean, I can go on. And then in the immediate aftermath of Durban, you saw its legacy beginning, because in the immediate aftermath, I mentioned 9/11, but what happened is that right after 9/11 is that the Jews were blamed, for 9/11 as a kind of initial fallout from Durban. There was a conference that took place at the University of Michigan, which was launching the BDS movement, and it was incredible because a resolution that said we can recognize Israel if it became a democratic state was defeated, to be replaced by a resolution that called for the dismantling of Israel as a racist apartheid state. And this took place right in the aftermath of Durban. The UN Commission on Human Rights met in the immediate aftermath of Durban, and here too, a majority of the resolutions singling out Israel for selective appropriate indictment, the major human rights violators enjoying exculpatory immunity. And perhaps the most egregious example of all, and that is in December 2001, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, the corpus of international humanitarian law, met for the first time to put a state in the docket. It wasn't any of the countries one might have assumed should have been put in the docket, whether we're talking about Syria or Iran. No, the only state put in the docket 52 years later in the docket of the accused was Israel. And I might add, since then, on two other occasions, and when they met, again, the only state put in the docket accused. So Durban, in effect, unleashed this tipping point of hate and what I would call demonological anti-Semitism that we're witnessing today, 20 years later, namely, to sum it up in one line, the notion of Israel as a racist, imperialist, colonialist, settler, ethnic cleansing, child murdering, apartheid, Nazi state, all those indictments began at Durban.
So, Owen, before Durban, there was in fact a conference in Kenya before, and there's a preparation conference that took place in Tehran. So who was behind this? These things don't spontaneously erupt. How did this was clearly carefully planned, carefully orchestrated, properly funded? Who was behind it?
So, when you mention Tehran, that's really where those of us who were watching what was going on saw what was about to happen, because there were 4 regional conferences on the road to Durban. The last 4 was the Asian one in Tehran. To that conference, Israel was excluded and Jewish NGOs were excluded. And that was, as I say, in February 2001. So on the road to Durban, we already were beginning to witness what was going to happen at Durban. And because there was no outrage in what happened in Tehran, that took us down the road to Durban, because in Tehran was issued, and this became part of the documentary framework for the conference itself, in Tehran was issued the worst indictment of Israel since the end of the Second World War, where in that regional conference, Israel was referred to as a racist, apartheid, criminal Nazi state. And so you see the groundwork was then being laid.
So, Felice, why were we so unprepared?
I want to distinguish between the two conferences, first of all. There was a governmental conference and there was an NGO forum, and the NGO forum was separate from the governmental conference. And a lot of what we're going to talk about is dealing with the NGO forum. When it comes to the governmental conferences, there was an expectation that states would be looking at their own situations. There had been 2 world conferences before. These world conferences on racism in 1978 and 1983 were largely focused on South Africa and on the apartheid problem. The expectation was that this one would be quite different because it was post-Cold War, it was post-apartheid, it was post-Bosnia, Rwanda. And there was the expectation that states would be, and there was the requirement that states would discuss their own and provide reports on their own situations and their own activities. The Western states looked to those issues. The Latin American states looked to those issues, weren't too happy with what they found. NGOs from many of these countries who were in minorities were brought together in separate meetings for this. The governmental conferences were kind of an afterthought. The mainstream NGOs, by the way, didn't participate until the very last conference when they showed up to try to maintain the support for universal rights and things of that sort. There was this clear warning that came from the United States that they would only participate if this conference did not repeat what happened previously. So the US was pushing, do not say Zionism is racism again. That was their focus, and their other focus was, and don't get into this talk about reparations. They were focused on a negative. There was a change of administrations. The world was experiencing an intifada and terrorism and blowing up cafes in Israel and things of that sort. There wasn't a lot of diplomatic attention being paid to the World Conference on Racism. And as Congressman Tom Lantos, who did participate in the Durban conference and in the earlier preparatory conference, said, the veneer of civilization is paper thin. We're its guardians and we must never rest. And the outcome, the feeling that resulted from this conference, and it's a message for future action, is that we have to root out racism, but disconnect from Durban. And I'd like to make that the main focus of my remarks.
So Erwin, we keep on talking about the main conference and the NGO conference. What was the connection between the two? How did it practically work?
Well, Felicia, there were 2 conferences. There was the conference, an intergovernmental forum, you might call it, of official delegations. And I was part of the Canadian delegation. Much of what I was describing took place at the NGO forum, which I also, would participate in when I wasn't part of the governmental forum. But I have to say that even the governmental forum also had its own disturbing discourse during, not in the same way as in the NGO forum, but it was there. And at the end of the day, the only state singled out in the concluding declaration of Durban was Israel. The NGO forum, however, was replete, as I said, with a kind of posters and pamphlets and demonstrations and chanting. And that was an ongoing theme of really hijacking of human rights. And that really, as I said, was a tipping point for what I would call the laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of human rights, under the cover of anti-racism, which post-Durban then began to manifest itself, particularly in the international arena.
So there was, in fact, a text submitted from the NGO Forum to the plenary forum, and Mary Robinson, who was chair, refused to present it.
Well, at the end of the NGO Forum, a document was compiled based on 19 thematic groups and 39 NGO caucuses. That alone tells you how mixed up it was. And this document contained a section from the Palestinian and Arab caucus, which had language in it which said wildly language along the lines of what Erwin just described: genocide, apartheid, colonial Nazi type accusations. The Jewish groups had wanted to identify what needed to be done to eradicate anti-Semitism. And it actually pointed to that kind of language as one of the problems. As a result, the non-governmental organizations, in a cacophony of misbehavior, voted to take out the language from the Jewish caucus, from the state, from the NGO document. I won't go into the details, but boy, could I. And there was a document that was finalized. And Mary Robinson raised questions about paragraphs 418 and 419 that used words like apartheid and genocide, criticizing Israel. And she said, we don't use this kind of language. And the NGOs demanded that she resign. Palestinian NGOs demanded that she resign. They challenged her. She said, I won't recommend this to the NGO, to the governmental conference. Now, frankly, no Secretary General has ever recommended a document from an NGO forum to a governmental conference, any of the ones I referred to before or otherwise. But she said to them, I won't present it to them. And they were not very happy about this. There was a steering committee that was trying to fix the text of the document. They actually were raided, bombarded, intimidated, attacked. The documents were diskettes were taken, stolen. The people were physically ousted from the place. And there was quite a dust up after the NGO conference finished. Mary Robinson was the Secretary General of the conference, both conferences, actually. The NGO Forum was under her auspices as well. But to tell you what was going on at the NGO conference, it was being organized by Sangoko, a South African NGO, which had had no experience with UN work whatsoever. And the last concluding plenum of the conference was addressed at the invitation of the NGO Forum, nobody knows who, but I think it's pretty clear. It was addressed by Fidel Castro, who spoke for more than 2 hours. And when he finished, and Mary Robinson took the stage and said, Mr. Prime Minister, I hope you'll, Mr. President, I hope you'll be concerned about racism in your own country as well, or something like that, prisoners in your own country as well, the audience booed her. This was the atmosphere that I'm talking about when I talk about a deterioration, a degradation, a Lord of the Flies atmosphere at the conference. The NGO Forum, which brought in people from all over the world who'd had no experience at kind of international conferences, but had had great experience domestically at confronting people and intimidating people, were used precisely for that purpose. And it was a horror show.
Erwin, the American delegation and the Israeli delegation walked out. Should they have stayed in the conference and fought, or should they have exited?
I understood why they walked out, and I think they walked out as a matter of principle. And I remember, discussing it with Tom Lantos, and there was even discussion amongst the Canadian delegation as to whether we should leave. I have to say, I discussed it at the time with Rabbi Melchior. He was the deputy foreign minister of Israel and headed up the Israeli delegation. And Rabbi Melchior said, no, I think it's also important if you stay and make points that might not otherwise not be made. And so we stayed, and I think we sought to make the case as to how a world conference against racism turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel. So I understood why the Americans left. And as I said, it was a decision based as a matter of principle and policy. And we stayed for reasons that were not unlike why the Americans left, but in order to make the case there, because the Americans had left, that it needed to be made.
Owen, you've been a campaigner for human rights. You've been an international human rights lawyer your entire life. Did Durban actually set back the cause of human rights in the world?
No doubt in my mind that it did set back the cause of human rights. On a personal level, Durban has been indelibly imprinted on my memory and on my being. I think those of us who were at Durban were in one form or another, transformed by that experience. And as I say, I think the legacy of Durban is not only the legacy of hate as we've described it, that would be bad enough. The legacy of Durban is that it became a tipping point for the laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of human rights and anti-racism, which we're still witnessing today. And I would just say laundering of anti-Semitism under the protective cover of the UN, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, under the very struggle against racism itself. And I think that legacy is still with us.
Felice, I'm just busy looking at the list of members of the United Nations Human Rights Council at the moment. People like China, and we understand China's gross abuse of human rights. Cuba, we understand the abysmal record that Cuba has. Pakistan, Russian Federation, Uzbekistan. I mean, the list of members of the United Nations Human Rights Committee is an abysmal record of some of the worst human rights abusers in the world. Does the United Nations have any credibility when it comes to human rights at all?
The United Nations is more important in the field of human rights than it is in the area of disarmament or conflict resolution or economic development. It is where the concepts were founded, defined, and given given mechanisms through which they could be implemented. The struggle to keep that Human Rights Commission and now the Human Rights Council, which is a political body made up of member states, doing that kind of work has been an ongoing one. There are experts like Dr. Shahid, who'll speak later, who act independently and advise the council and carry these issues forward. There are treaty bodies that are independent, that interpret the treaties and hold the governments to account to the extent that they can. They're not given any enforcement powers. But the United Nations Human Rights Council is not a court. It's a political body, and it has, the current one has 47 members. The prior one had 53. There's 193 members of the United Nations, a quarter of them. And the admission ticket is not how good you are. The admission ticket is how many votes you get. And what has happened is the different governments around the world have agreed to put countries on by region, and with consensus agreement. It's your turn now, it's somebody else's turn later. The great powers, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have generally been elected and re-elected routinely to the council. So there's no surprise that Russia, China, and others are there. The challenge is to make this election process a better one and to establish such criteria for membership. It hasn't been done. The US has tried to get it done, but the world is the way the world is. And the choice is, do you let those other countries redefine human rights and turn it into something like the Lord of the Flies situation I've described, ideologize it to make it a political brickbat, or do you try to keep these principles to what they actually mean? That is why governments participate. That is why you see the UK just ran for and got a seat on the council. That is why a few years ago, we've seen all measure of different countries try to be part of the council in order to keep the fight going and to protect human rights to the extent that they can. So yeah, I was with Bill Corey when he took the Freedom House Index and said, how many of these countries measure up by the Freedom House Index? And that's become the gold standard for judging who's on the council in the future. But the fact of the matter is, the world is as it is. Shall we throw out the United Nations altogether? Shall we throw out the African Union? Shall we throw out the ASEAN and the OAS as well? Because all of them have bad members in them. The answer is, we think that there is some value in multilateral diplomacy and in multilateral institutions. And in the area of human rights, it's only going to be protected if we speak up, speak out, and act to protect those rights for everyone.
Howard, just on that point for a second, because I think Felice made an important point in terms of the work of the UN special procedures. And I know we make representations, for example, to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention or on disappearances, and they do important work. But I just want to sound one word of warning on this, and that is the UN Council on Human Rights just established a permanent investigative inquiry with respect to not only Israel violations in the occupied territories, but within Israel itself. And this in the as a result of the Hamas war in Israel, where Hamas is not even mentioned in the resolution establishing this UN Commission of Inquiry, and where those appointed to head up this Commission of Inquiry have all publicly stated their own condemnations before that. So you've got here a kind of Alice in Wonderland situation where the conviction and sentence have already been adopted before the hearing begins.
Well, let's hear from some of the people who were in Durban as well. Mary, you were based at the Jewish Club. Tell us what it was like. Give us a sense of what it was like in Durban in 2001.
Thanks, Howard, and thank you so much to Erwin and Felice for your excellent sort of creating the context. I must say my stomach's in a knot when I hear it all again. It's 20 years later, but it was a traumatic experience, if I might say. I mean, I think when Erwin said that it's imprinted on his mind, I think it's in our psyche. I had been recently elected to the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, KZN Council, and I was allocated the responsibility. There was this big conference that we were planning for at least 2 years, and I was allocated the responsibility to run the Durban Jewish Club, which is a beautiful establishment that was created in the early 1930s in response to prejudice against Jews at the local country clubs. So the Jewish Club was established, and it's a beautiful facility not far from the International Convention Center where the conference was taking place. And the idea was that we would have a space. We set up a media section where international media houses were broadcasting about the conference from the center, and the Jewish delegations from around the world had Shabbat dinner there. We were going to have chavashaft and camaraderie amongst the Jewish communities from around the world. It was going to be an opportunity for this tiny little Durban Jewish community and the South African Jewish community to connect. And oh, wow, it turned into being actually an oasis for those participants who were actually going into both the NGO conference and the governmental conference to come back and actually debrief and de-stress and strategize on how to respond to where we were caught so off guard. And so the printing of T-shirts, the strategies about who should withdraw, who shouldn't withdraw, discussing each and every letter and syllable on every resolution took place at the Durban Jewish Center. But for me personally, I was born in Durban. I grew up on the streets of Durban. And when Felice refers to it was a breakdown of civilization and posters and pamphlets that Hitler didn't do a good enough job, and that the Nature Carta were demonstrating, and the elders of Zion were, the protocols were being sold on the streets that I'd grown up. And the fact that the legacy of Durban is a legacy of hate has had a massive impact on me. And I think it spurred me on in terms of the role that I wanted to play in combating everything that was established in that hateful week in Durban. And I think reference has been made to the conference packed up on Friday. We had a weekend, and on Monday we had a council meeting where we spoke briefly about the conference. And I remember my contribution to the discussion was that it had left me with a terrible sense of foreboding, and Tuesday was 9/11. And it almost felt like, well, it had to be that something dramatic would come out of what was such obvious and unashamed hatred. So for me personally, it was traumatic on a level that was partly my own inexperience, but also partly because nobody there could have anticipated. It felt like we'd scratched the surface and every anti-Semite had crawled out from behind a bush and had created this cacophony of hatred. And I know that you'll hear from some of my colleagues and friends, Tamar, who's on the call and will be speaking very personally. She and I and a number of others were working closely together, and we tried to debrief with each other afterwards because it was hard to explain to people what we'd actually been through.
So Mary, when we talk about the hatred that was seen on the streets, are we talking about South Africans, or are we talking about foreign delegations? Who were these people who were selling the protocols of the elders of Zion? I believe at one point in time, there was chanting to the Jewish delegations, "You don't belong to the human race." And the Arab Lawyers Union were giving out posters and pamphlets of hook-nosed Jews and people with fangs, Jews with bloods coming out of their mouth. And there were placards that said Hitler should have finished the job. Were those local South Africans, or were those imports who had come in with the NGO forum?
I think it was a mixture, mostly the imports that had kind of let the genie out of the bottle amongst any locals. But amongst people that I knew or didn't know, I would say to people, do you know what is a Zionist? And friends of mine, colleagues, I'd walk up to people and say, in the course of that week, tell me what you know about Zionism. And people would look at me and go, nothing. So look, the majority of the people that on the streets were galvanized if they were participating. And it's maintained, the reality of that possibility has maintained in South Africa. If you go up to people and say what's happening in Israel is worse than what happened to us here during apartheid, it doesn't take much more than that to elicit support. And that's what we're dealing with. And that's the legacy that we were left with. That it's a cause that without any explanation or context was suddenly, this is as bad, if not worse, than what was very raw for us as South Africans. So any local participation was brought together by those that were imported. But as Felice said, the NGO conference was run by Mercia Andrews in the main, and a local South African organization.
So I see Jack Bloom has posted into the chat that he bought a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion for 20 Rand on the streets of Durban.
Indeed.
But Mark Pozniak, I'm wearing your T-shirt that you distributed at the conference. You were on the streets. You were there. You were heading the South African Union of Jewish Students. You were fighting street battles every single day. Tell us stories, explain to us what it was like being there as a Jew.
Thanks, Howard. And really, it's an incredible privilege to be on this panel. So thank you for the invitation. I do need to just correct one thing that all of the panelists have seemingly missed. And that was the incredibly important event that took place just prior to the NGO conference, which was the Student Summit.
Mhm.
So I was invited to the Student Summit, which happened a day or two before. I actually didn't go as part of a Jewish delegation. I was invited as part of what is now no longer, I think, the Tolerance Foundation. And it was a multinational, multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic grouping. It was my first year out of King David High School. Sorry, second year. I traveled, taken a gap year, but I'd come out of this cocoon of security and safety, and just, you know, proud Zionist, traditional, you know, Jew. Anyway, I arrived on the first day with this grouping, and the Student Summit, and I take it back to there because that's where it started for me. The Student Summit was held in a hotel. I can't remember which one now. And so I walked into the lobby, and there were breakout sessions being held in rooms off of the lobby, in conference halls. So I selected the one that had imperialism and you know, colonialism and whatever isms, lots of isms in the title of it, which I should have known better. But I walked in, and I was reasonably early, and I sat down, and the room wasn't full. And it began to fill up, and I slowly started to notice one person wearing a T-shirt with the famous image of, you know, Muhammad al-Dura that had been superimposed with blood on it, and Zionism is racism, and, you know, whatever you could think of. Okay, you know, I hadn't come across this. Then within a minute or two, there was another one and another one and another one, until eventually I looked up, and 60–70% of this conference room was wearing this T-shirt. So I thought I'd better go and have a look, you know, what was going on. And when I left the room, in the 30 minutes or so that I'd been inside, to the time that I'd come back outside, they had transformed the foyer, or the lobby of this hotel, into a shuk, or a bazaar of hatred. There were T-shirts being handed out, and Israeli flags being torn up, and shouting and screaming, and pamphlets being handed out. And I was convinced I was the only Jew in the world. There was nobody present, nobody else. And I was lost, completely lost, and completely finished, shattered. And then I heard Hebrew. And I'm afraid it's 12 years at King David High School, Linksfield, and my Hebrew is not amazing, but it's possible enough that I could see two people arguing. And my limited Hebrew was enough to know that the guy, he was on my team. And the girl, she was not on my team. And the fight ended, and he began to walk away, and I ran after him, and I grabbed him, and I said to him, Achi, Ani Yehudi. It was all I could get out, brother. I'm a Jew. And it was enough. It was enough in that moment, in that connection, that I had now found home. There was now somebody there. That person was Peleg Reshev, and Peleg was there. He was the chair of the World Union of Jewish Students. And it was in that moment that I left the group that I was part of, and I joined the few Jewish students that were there. Because I think, you know, the leaders of the group that I was part of understood, you know, either I had to go home, or I had to not be with them, because it wasn't possible. And from there, we moved on to the NGO, and to the NGO forum, and to the vociferousness of what's been described. And I have to tell you, I don't, you know, I think Erwin said it so well, and Mary echoed it, this mark that Durban left on you. You know, for me personally, so what was my overarching, once we got over the shock, Howard. You know, being on the streets, there weren't a lot of us. When we say the streets, you know, inside the NGO forum, you know, it's picture like a fairground almost. You know, there's meetings taking place, but there's open public spaces. It didn't take long for the Jews to be recognizable. We were recognized. Everybody knew who was Jewish. There weren't a lot of us. So, you know, I had an experience in the NGO forum where I was talking to somebody, I can't remember what we were discussing, but I was having a discussion and a third person walked up and ignored me and said to the person I was talking to, "Why are you talking to him? Don't you know he's Jewish?" And what was more shocking than the question was the answer. The answer came and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know." And they walked off. And for me, Durban was a place where you know, it's apt, but the mask, you know, we all have to wear masks now, but the masks got to slip. You know, you didn't need a mask you didn't have to hide behind anti-Zionism. You didn't even have to hide behind human rights. You didn't have to hide behind anything. This was a place where you could choose to hate me because I was Jewish. Didn't make a difference. And you could say that. You could say it. It was fine. But in saying all of that, as traumatic as it was, for me personally, it was unbelievably empowering. It's once we got over the shock, you know, it was the closest at 19 years old to be on the front line, fighting, doing something proactive for something I believed in. It led me as a product of King David to have to question a lot of what I was taught, to have to dig a little deeper and understand things a little better. But it certainly defined for me a future which said that, you know, I knew then and there that I needed to find a way to make a contribution to the people, to the Jewish people, the people of Israel. You know, you know, not just be on the receiving end and the take. I had to figure out a way to contribute. And I came back from that trip, joined Soldiers, from Soldiers, you know, into the Board of Deputies, and you know, kind of where we are today. So traumatic,
Mark,
yes, but that was.
I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Mary. The people that were leading this, were they local South Africans or were they foreigners? Where was this coming from? I think there's a very interesting comment that Jack Bloom, who we mentioned earlier, said that he bought his Protocols of the Elders of Zion on the streets for 20 Rand, but it was on sale from a stall from the Atul Bait Foundation, and it was an official publication of the Iranian government printed in Tehran.
So Howard, I think I'm gonna point you to the example of the T-shirt you're wearing. You know, we handed out hundreds and thousands of those, you know, and I hazard to say that most of the people who took them from us didn't necessarily have a sense of belonging to what we were handing out or understand what the shirt was saying. They took it. It was a free shirt. So I think that we had individuals or organizations well organized. So Mercia Andrews, yes, I can still see her wearing her keffiyeh all day, every day, running Sangoko. And that was a South African organization. But absolutely, this thing was, I would argue, funded and thought up externally. But one has to remember, if we take ourselves out of the horror and the shock of what that place was for us, if I try and place myself as another person there, there was a festive atmosphere. If you weren't Jewish or South African, there was activity and there was action. And so I think there was a lot of opportunity for local South Africans who were perhaps not as sophisticated or as nuanced in their understanding of issues to be swept up and caught up in what was the cause of the day. You know, this was what was happening on the streets. This was what was happening in the NGO. This was what was happening at the student forum. And they all got to listen to Fidel Castro. I said Hanan Ashwari, by the way, for that. I snuck into the speech for 2 hours. I couldn't sit through 2 hours though.
So just before we ask for more stories of Durban, tell us what your days were like. What did you do during the conference itself?
So yeah, essentially, I think Mary describes it quite well. You know, so we obviously, I don't think we're as we weren't as tied up or wrapped with the formalities of what was going on at the conference. We were planning a ground game, and that ground game was, we need to print 5,000 t-shirts. You know, and what are we going to put on the t-shirts? We've got to get them printed. And here, Mary's quite correct. I mean, the support that the community provided. Thank you very much. Quite amazing that it still stands up, huh? The support.
Not racism, not Jews.
The infrastructure provided, the support that the community provided, the Jewish Board of Deputies, the Durban community. We wanted for nothing. And yet we're focused on, tomorrow, what are we going to do tomorrow? Tomorrow, we've got to get a combi, and we're going to take, combi's a van. We're going to take the combi, and we're going to drive this combi, and we're going to park it here, and we're going to hand out 5,000 t-shirts. We're going to have it printed. And then we almost got attacked for handing out the t-shirts. So the police came, and the police formed a human shield around us. So we had eventually we had like bodyguards, because there was like 20 of us. It was really like 20 of us walking around, and everybody knew who we were. So our days were spent setting up focal points, whether it was handing out a t-shirt or singing a song or handing out flowers while singing salam, while surrounded by police bodyguards. This is what we did, and we did it every day. And it was frightening. And it was traumatic, but it was invigorating. I can't help it. It meant something to me. We did it.
Tamara, you were on the streets as well. Tell us about your experience.
Thank you, Howie. And really, it's bringing in such amazing memories and scary and happy and meaningful. So I was there, I held the ticket of one of the delegates for WITO, Women International Zionist Organization. We were 5 delegates. 2 of them were from Durban. It was Karen Peer, that was at the time the chairman. I was immediate past chairman. And because we were local and from Durban, we joined in helping in organizing the Jewish caucus. I hosted in my house Pele Greshev, the students, 2 of them, all of us in Durban, as a very warm and welcoming community, hosted the students. I had the combi, the van, and we were going in to do the good job of each NGO that was represented there, and there were many. Each organization with what they had to contribute. And it was exciting and wonderful. Here we have a UN conference in our city. And as Mary described it, we had the club, the Jewish club, and we had literally within 3 kilometers walking from the club, you could walk to the stadium where the NGO conference was and the governmental one at the conference center. And it was exciting till we walked into that stadium. And the first day that you walked into the stadium, it was like walking into a gladiator fight. It became a stadium of hate, and was that what it was felt like. Because there we are, and it wasn't just handed out, you say, pamphlets. There was exhibitions with those paintings and information. It was so well organized inside the stadiums, in the tents. And Mark described it, yes, from the outside it was very festive, but for us, we were the ones that were fighting for our lives inside there. And going into each session and each talk, it was hijacked. It was pointless going. You went into a session and talk that was talking about racism. Somewhere else, somebody would stand up and and hijack the conversation and say, what about the Palestinian? And literally those that needed really to express their plight could not do it. And those that could contribute and maybe come with understanding and way forward could not do it. It was absolute taken over. And then we realized from the very beginning that that wasn't the purpose of the conference. We can't come and do our work. And we gathered at the Jewish Club as the Jewish caucus. And what are we going to do now? And we all gathered together to fight what is happening there and put aside what we plan to do and gather as organization, all the NGOs together, whoever could join in to see what we can do. And mainly we had 13 students that were our soldiers. We had, with the help of the embassy, there were materials. We did envelopes with media packs. And in those media packs, we had a T-shirt. We had a video that was supplied by the Israeli embassy. There were material, printed material. We worked in the Jewish Club all hours of the day and night. And we had those materials, and we then had the students running around town, going to anywhere and anybody that they could think that will take those envelopes, look at them and use them. And as Mark said, we had filled up the combis and run around anywhere that they can go, drop them, bring them in the conference. I myself, I was, as Mark said, was attacked. I was physically attacked at the conference by a senior member of the NGO conference official that literally physically attacked me when we were taking out the T-shirts. The hatred was so bad, so bad. You felt it. They were following our cars, intimidating, taking down registration numbers, trying to scare us. And it was scary. It was very, very scary. And the days were going in and out. We were there till late at night in the club and discussing every night, how was the day? What are we doing the next day? And I want to point out to an experience that stayed with me very strongly. And that the good experience is that as bad as it was, there was that glimmer of light. There was some good, and the good came from our friends, the Christian Zionists. That as bad as it was, they were there, and the groups of Christian Zionists came with material, adverts in the press, a banner on the way to the airport, and were there trying to help us fight the fight. And there was one occasion late at night towards the very end of the conference when the discussion was we wanted to present the amendments to the NGO conference, and we're sitting what we do. The government, Israel and America, walked out of the conference, and we were sitting there. What shall we do if we go out? I felt very strongly that what are we doing here? The students were running around fighting, endangering their lives and trying to fight the fight. And we will just walk out of the conference. And the suggestion was, we're sitting, how can we present things? And we're sitting late at night, and I think it was close to midnight at the club discussing, and come in one of the security and say to us, sorry, there are people here, we're not sure who they are, what they are, but they want to come in. And it was a group of Christian NGO that came from Holland, if I'm not mistaken. And they came in and they say, we are going to stand with you. We are going to push the amendments that we wanted to put, that we wanted to suggest. And it was that feeling that you're not alone. That was just that positive side that came out of that there are people that still care.
Tamar, how did this whole thing affect your view of Durban?
I moved to Cape Town.
Did you move to Cape Town because the concept of Durban was tarnished for you?
It was, so as Mary said, literally a week later, 9/11 happened. And among us, first of all, the week after the conference, we all walked around in a douar. People were asking us, what's wrong? What happened? Why are you looking the way you are? It was trauma. It was terrible. And then this terror attack happened, and the writing was on the wall. I remember calling Mary on the phone. We were after fetching our kids from school, and I'm saying to her, it was obvious it will happen. The writing was on the wall. How? When? No one could know. Well, no one would have known, but it happened. And it affected other places. It affected our children in the schools, wherever you were. It is affected your reality in South Africa, because here in South Africa, it happened. It's a country that racism shouldn't be here. That's not the right way. We're fighting racism in the country. Look where we came from. And here in South Africa, it's happening. And it's okay, and it's allowed. Yes, to me, it was a really changing point in my view of South Africa and life, and where I would like to be with my family. And it was difficult.
I want to ask Felice, because you were there on the ground as well. Tell us some of your stories, and I know you want to share some images as well.
Well, I offered some pictures of some of the things that were going on at Durban, because I thought the viewers might find them interesting. In the middle here were the Jewish students surrounded. It gives you some feeling for some of the chaos of some of the marches, and there are the Palestinians in the center. And you can see the flag on the side. If you go to the next picture, gives you a feeling. This was at a conference on anti-Semitism and how to eradicate anti-Semitism. And you'll see that the people who came were wearing these t-shirts. These were the other t-shirts, not the one you're wearing, Howard. And it said occupation, colonialism, racism, and Israel apartheid. And on the other side, it said apartheid is real, as one word, ISREAL, as a deliberate misspelling of the word Israel. These people with the keffiyehs around their necks and wearing these t-shirts came into this discussion. I think you see there's a Canadian woman speaking, making a presentation there of what was going on. And all at once, they came in to try to disrupt the conference. How do we know that it was deliberate and they came in to disrupt the conference? Well, when I was online on the way into the conference, before going through the security people, the people in front of me were talking about how they had to go at certain time to go and disrupt the conference. They knew that this was the plan. When I sat down in this tent and listened to the speakers, I turned around and there were two Cuban diplomats I knew from Geneva, from my service on these UN bodies. And I said, what are you doing here? And they started giggling. When this all got disrupted and the organizers broke up the meeting into 4 separate sections, they said, well, our job is done, let's go. They're right behind me. These things were obvious what was happening there. This was not, so when you say, was it insiders or outsiders? I wanted to say there were outsiders who joined the insiders. The local South African Palestinian solidarity groups made a liaison with the Palestinian groups before the conference, and the actions at the conference demonstrated just how deep that went. As far as who organized some of these things, if you go to the next picture, that's what you were wearing. Remember when these were being handed out, Marcia Andrews tried to block it, and the police had to come and threaten her to stop harassing the people who were getting the free t-shirts until she finally went away. You can go to the next. This is just an example of the attitudes of the Western media in terms of what this conference looked like to them, with pictures of not just people talking to each other, but you know, let's go, we finished our declaration here at Durban, let's go paint it on the wall of a synagogue. And things like that are the ideas. This was a poster that was seen at the conference. For the liberation of Quds, machine guns based on faith in Islam must be used. The jihadist message was there, the support of violence. These posters didn't just come out of nowhere. And then the next video, the next picture. Okay, this is the Hitler handbill that people have talked about. Okay, and this was in the Sunday Times, Durban, 9 September 2001. There's a headline, activist admits Hitler handbill was his idea. And the article explains that a person named Yusuf Didat, son of the Muslim scholar Ahmed Didat, and head of a South African committee, had printed these up and distributed them for his organization, the Islamic Propagation Center. And he explains that this was funded, this article explains that this initiative and his organization had been funded for some time by the Bin Laden family. The rest is your guess, it says on this handbill. A conference where something like this could be handed out. Who was connected to whom? These were not accidental, as some would say. I encourage everyone to read the Durban Diaries by a Swiss woman, Joëlle Fils, who was then head of the European Union of Jewish Students. Mark undoubtedly can tell us more about her role, but she gives a day-by-day account of what happened and how she came to do good things and how she gradually got sidelined, not just by the conference participants, and she talks a lot about the youth conference there as well. But even when the European students went and talked to Louis Michel, who was the head of the European Union delegation at the conference, for the official conference, and explained what was happening, he said, well, you know, if Sharon didn't do the things he's doing, maybe you wouldn't get this kind of a reaction. In other words, justifying anti-Semitism on the grounds of holding Jews collectively responsible for whatever the policies of the state of Israel are. This is classic anti-Semitism, and this was detailed by her in some detail. Now, the other thing I wanted to reference was Tamar spoke about the role of the saviors, so to speak. There was a remarkable Dutch group that was handling communications for everyone. They were called icare.to. Which was meant to say they cared, but they were a Dutch group that worked on anti-hate and still does. And when the Jewish groups were unable to present materials because of Sabbath issues and so forth, they appeared like winged avengers and said, we'll do it for you. We'll present the material for you. This was Ron Eisens and Suzette Bronkhorst, and they were remarkable at the conference. The East European caucus was incredible. They said, we recognize Bolshevik tactics when we see them. And that's what's going on here. They saw it in the meetings as well as otherwise. So what we had was a mixture. Oh, and plus let's talk about the international community. Major foundations and major governments provided huge sums so that NGOs could participate in the NGO forum from around the world. And indeed, there were about 6,000 delegates. For its part, Sangoko insisted that anybody coming had to pay $100 a registration fee. Nobody's ever been able to determine what was done with that money, I might add. But the international fellowships and subscriptions for people from groups that worked on anti-racism in their own country to get to Durban was a huge facilitator of what happened in Durban. And those groups with little experience, no leadership, were a big part of the problem of what I call the Lord of the Flies atmosphere. The Intergovernmental Conference was a disgrace to the human rights movement and to the United Nations. The participants in the conference, many of them had good intentions, but there was a dedicated group, a political group that had other plans and carried those plans out, the results of which are a whole array of people, not only who were traumatized by Durban, but who understood that this is a lesson that must never be forgotten, and that what happened at the NGO conference deeply affected what was going on at the governmental conference, because it set the atmosphere. It allowed for a kind of ugly anti-Semitic demonstrations, both in the town and in the conference grounds per se, that one had not seen before. And it led to a conference supposedly fighting hatred and racism, which was exhibiting racism and hatred against one people, and those people were the Jews.
It stole victimhood away from many of the victims who came to be heard. And that's one of the great tragedies.
And that is the governmental conference story, because the offending language, I know you're going to get to the governmental conference, but the offending language in the governmental conference, which the European governments and Canada felt they had cleaned up completely. And if you read the language that they cleaned up, which I still have the original copy of, by itself, it's okay. But they inserted this language about Palestinians being victims of racism, and in a paragraph, and Israel being needing to have security, into the section of the document called Victims of Racism, thereby establishing that Palestinians are victims and Israelis and Jews are perpetrators. And by this action alone, they turned this conference into one that we have to disconnect from Durban. Fight racism, not Jews. Disconnect from Durban, root out racism.
So Ambassador Tova Herzl, you were Israeli ambassador to South Africa at the time. Why did it all go wrong?
Well, the question of why it went wrong is really a United Nations question, and more than a South African question. And my UN experience is very limited. But I think one of the main things that went wrong was that generally when the UN conferences, the regional groups provide drafts. And somebody in headquarters sits down and puts the drafts together and gets rid of the problematic language. And what was decided, I think it was between Mary Robinson and Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who was the South African foreign minister at the time, whatever the official title is, I don't remember, was to leave it in brackets and leave it to be decided in Durban. That's quite unusual and it's quite precedented. Usually the language, the draft, which delegates deal with, has already been cleaned up of problems. And for some reason, I don't know if it was naivete or I have no idea why they decided to leave it for Durban. And that was the root of the problem. And eventually after Israel and the United States walked out, or the United States and Israel walked out, really all the stuff that was left in brackets was cleaned up. Had that been cleaned up before, there wouldn't have been the big problem in the governmental conference. But I think the trauma of Durban isn't just the governmental conference. Felice spoke about a film, and I'd like to mention a film, A Perfect Storm, which came out, I think, round about that time when there was somebody on a boat and then the currents were problematic and there was rain and there was wind. Everything happened at once. And there was nothing one could do against it. When we say Durban, what we really mean is three different Durbans. It was the street, which had not seen anything like that in any country with a sizable Jewish community, a meaningful Jewish community, a country that has diplomatic relations with Israel. So the street was one Durban, the NGO was another Durban, and the governmental conference was a third Durban. And the three of them together, I think if it had just been one of each one alone, wouldn't have been quite so traumatic. But the three of them together is phew. And people have been sharing personal stories, so I'll share one of mine, and then I'll be happy to answer questions. So on Friday afternoon, just after the conference began, there was a very big demonstration, and we were told to leave and be safe, and we went back to the hotel. And I called my mother before Shabbat from my hotel room. It was at the Hilton in Durban. And she was watching I was watching the demonstration from my hotel window, and she was watching it on television in Jerusalem. And she said to me, now you know what it's like. And my mother, some of you know, is a graduate of Auschwitz, etc. And she said to me, now you know what it's like. And I said, what do you mean what's what like? And she said anti-Semitism. And for me, that moment was a wow. It was my wow moment of the Durban conference, because we were watching the same thing. And, you know, somehow you always say to yourself, you know, Israel's not perfect. Maybe Israel shouldn't do this, maybe Israel shouldn't do that. But obviously, this conference was way beyond criticism of Israel, but considering who she was and where she came from and what she said, it was my wow moment from Durban.
So, Topher, there's been a lot of criticism by the South African Jewish community at how, in fact, they weren't supported by the Israeli embassy. People tell me stories that, in fact, the embassy officials and materials arrived almost when the conference was over, that many of the students actually felt betrayed by the Israeli embassy and felt that, in fact, you had tried to take over, you had disempowered them, you hadn't supported them at all, and relationships between the Jewish community and the Israeli embassy actually suffered greatly because of the Durban conference.
I haven't heard this before, so I really am not in a position to respond to that. I've never heard this before. I'm sorry. And when you say that, I think when you say the embassy is a technical, and I'm sorry that people feel that way, and I'd love to hear more about it. So, you know, we have to have got advance notice. I could have prepared properly, but I think that it's not the embassy who's in charge. The embassy happens to be in the host country. It's the foreign ministry. We just happen to supply some of the technical services. But I'm not sure what some of the comments are, and so I really can't respond to them. I'm sorry.
So when you came to the conference, were you in the plenary, were you in the governmental conference? And what was it like?
I was in the plenary. I was a delegate, and it was probably a little more civilized, a little more played by the rules than the NGO conference, and certainly more than the street. But it was unpleasant, and a lot of the work was happening in subcommittee, you know, in various committees and formulating and so on. Some happened in the plenary. You know, I was sitting there, you know, walked past Yasser Arafat as he was going to address the place. And the whole thing wasn't pleasant, but it was this perfect storm of everything. It wasn't just the plenary. It was everything, all together, all at once.
Tell us about the decision to actually walk out of the conference.
So look, before the conference, there was a very big debate about, what Israel should do, because as it became clear that the nasty language in brackets was going to remain in and would be a subject for discussion, there was a question of, will we come, won't we come? Will we participate, won't we participate? And also, at which level will we participate? Mm-hmm. We were making decisions. Again, this was done between Jerusalem and Washington. Pretoria was at most informed about what was going on. This was between Jerusalem and Washington. And at which level we would be represented. For example, if Colin Powell, who was the Secretary of State at the time, as I remember, would have decided to come, then presumably Shimon Peres, who was the foreign minister, would also have come. When the Americans decided that their delegation would be headed by, let's call it a mid-level official, not the Director General, not the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, Israel made the decision that we would be represented on the same level. Whether it was correct to participate, whether it was correct to participate at this level. I think it's very difficult to say, because on the one hand, having this level of representation made it hard to communicate, for example, with ministers, because ministers said, he's a mid-level official, we don't want to talk to him. On the other hand, it did show our displeasure. Maybe we shouldn't have come at all. The decision to walk out, I think, was made on the Monday between the American delegation and the Israeli delegation, but it was made between Washington and Jerusalem. It was not made on the ground, based on the direction that the conference was taking, that the bracketed texts, which pointed a finger at Israel, made it impossible for us and for America to stay. We have to remember that America also had the issue, which was the issue of reparations. So their agenda at the conference wasn't just Israel having fingers pointed at it. I do want to say that the final draft, even though it's problematic, I have here a text that Shimon Peres spoke about when the conference ended, after we had walked out, and he said, the closing resolution is a very important achievement. It is a painful come down for the Arab League. I'm very pleased with this resolution. Had this been the direction at the beginning of the conference, then a lot of the drama would have been spared. Unfortunately, South Africa got it together with the United Nations right towards the end. And may I remind everybody that the conference was extended by 1 day in order to resolve all the outstanding issues.
So Toko, who were the state players really behind this?
In terms of getting the acceptable resolution, I think it was the Europeans, I think it was the Canadians, it was the Australians, with America behind the scenes. American delegates stayed behind, not officially, after they'd walked out. And the people who were against us, they were the usuals. But South Africa, as you know, climbed off the tree and was very instrumental. Aziz Pahad was there, and they were very instrumental in getting a formulation which the Europeans could sign on, and which Mr. Peres praised the way he did. So eventually South Africa, you know, after we walked out, did what it had to do in order to make an acceptable resolution.
Do we know which state players were behind the funding of the NGO conference?
I don't
and the
know.
hijacking of it?
I don't know.
So let's talk about the impact of South African-Israel relations post the conference. Okay. Because South Africa has been one of the countries that has been trying very hard to perpetuate the memory of Durban. We're now heading to Durban number 4. Right. How do you see South Africa-Israel relations having been affected by what happened in Durban?
Look, first of all, it's been 20 years, and I'm not qualified to speak of South Africa-Israeli relations now, but I'd like to remind you that at the South African Zionist Conference, which was, I believe, in February or March the following year, 6 months or so after, 8 months after the conference, Aziz Pahad, who was then the deputy foreign minister, but was very instrumental, as those of you who were familiar at the time know, he asked to speak at the South African Zionist Conference. And he asked to speak about Durban, and he came up with something which was, I'm afraid I didn't note the text for myself as I prepared for this meeting. He came up with a text which was about as close to an apology as could be expected, because I think South Africa realized that it was not good for the relationship. I think South Africa realized that it put the Jewish community into a great deal of distress. And I think South Africa also realized that if it wants to be an international player, a conference like this cannot be repeated. And so I'm jumping a year, I'm sorry, I'm speaking out of turn, but the following year there was the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. And again, it was an international conference, and this time, South Africa limited the demonstrations. The United Nations and South Africa, as the host country together, made sure there was a reasonable text before the conference so that it wouldn't be hijacked again. Israel and related organizations like Jewish organizations, for example, there was a huge delegation of students from Israel who came to be prepared in case there would be a problem. So I think everybody learned their lesson from Durban. The United Nations, South Africa, Israel in its own way. Whether that lesson is still taught, I don't know. Is still understood, I don't know.
So Owen Kotler, so I heard someone describe Durban as the zombie conference. It keeps on coming back from the dead every 5 years. So let's talk about the impact, because in fact, we've had Durban 2 and we've had Durban 3 and we're about to have Durban 4. Durban 2 took place under the guidance of Ahmadinejad in Iran and became the Holocaust Denial Conference. And Durban 3 really took place under the influence of Muammar Gaddafi. We've seen the fight against racism really being led by some of the worst human rights abusers in the world. Why? Why do we allow this? Why do we tolerate this? Why do we destroy the entire foundation of human rights by allowing people like Gaddafi and Ahmadinejad to actually control the agenda?
Well, what you had, as I said, is that Durban became a tipping point. The Durban of hate then continued to metastasize, and it would metastasize, in international forums. It would metastasize in NGO forums, and it would find expression in the successor Durban forums. I just want, if I may, Howard, to some of the comments earlier, because just to reference it, but not lose the context. Reference was made by Mark de Peleg-Reshev. I just want to say I was witness to Peleg-Reshev intervening when some came to beat up some Jewish students, and he personally fought them off. I never forgot that, and he and I became friends after that. But I think it deserves to be recalled, because he really showed incredible courage when a group of students were being assaulted, and he intervened and fought them off. The second thing is, and this too, I think needs to be part of the question when you say what happened in second, Durban, third. What happened at Durban 1 that needs to also be remembered is some of the mainstream NGOs were enablers for what happened at Durban 1. And they have continued to be enablers. And when you see a report by Human Rights Watch that comes out in 2021, which refers to Israel as an apartheid state, well, Human Rights Watch was at that Durban 1 conference, and they were, some of their officials there, acting as enablers. And so I think that too has to be addressed, and that fed into the governmental forums, as Felice and others have mentioned, that got influence. And when we talk, and people abuse the word here, the trauma, and that we were all transformed. I have to say that I remember when I came back from Durban, and my wife saw me. Apparently, I not only was transformed as I felt in my psyche, I was transformed physically, because when she said to me, she said, "I don't even recognize you." She said, "What happened to you?" She said, "You got 5 years older in 2 weeks." And Durban had that impact. But at the same time, and it was also mentioned, while it was traumatic, it was empowering. And that, I think, has engaged all of the people who are on these panels, have been engaged, very much so. And then your question about Israel and South African, the relationships afterwards. I have to say that I think what happened here, and it's part of the larger context that I'm trying to frame, is that Israel, like other democracies, was unprepared for what happened at Durban. They didn't anticipate what was going to happen at Durban, but people looked to Israel as if it should have been prepared. And I think that was one part of the problem. The second thing is that Israel's focus was entirely on the intergovernmental forum, not on the NGO forum. That's why Shimon Peres could make the statement that he made, which appeared to be disconnected from those of us who are at the NGO forum and the atmospherics there, etc. And they made the statement that he did. And I want to single out Rabbi Michael Melchior. He was the deputy foreign minister of Israel at the time. He couldn't come to Durban, but he was very much in touch with us. And he himself acknowledged that Israel was unprepared for what was to happen at Durban, and in particularly unprepared for the NGO forum.
So David Harris, a big welcome to you from the American Jewish Committee. Great to have you with us. Tell us what you think the impact has been of Durban on world Jewry, on Israel, on the way we perceive human rights generally.
Howard, first of all, may I thank the Board of Deputies and my friends, including Wendy Kahn, for the invitation. Look, let me explain my role in this. I was invited at the end of August of 2001 to join the United States official delegation to Durban, which it was presumed would be led by Colin Powell. So I had packed my bags. Colin Powell then indicated that he would not be going, that the United States delegation would be led at a lower level than by the Secretary of State. And then, as we all know, on September the 3rd, Colin Powell issued a very powerful statement. And Howard, just allow me to read a sentence or two, because it creates the framework, I think, for what happened next. Colin Powell said, and I quote, "But following discussions today by our team in Durban and others who are working for a successful conference, I am convinced that will not be possible," referring to the fight against racism. "I know that you do not combat racism by conferences that produce declarations containing hateful language, some of which is a throwback to the days of Zionism equals racism, or supports the idea that we have made too much of the Holocaust, or suggests that apartheid exists in Israel, or that singles out only one country in the world, Israel, for censure and abuse." In my view, and having the benefit of having spoken with many, including my colleague Felice Gare and Joel Fisk, whose Durban Diaries was published by AJC, I should note, Durban has become synonymous. It has entered the lexicon in a way, for me, as places like Munich and Evian have entered the lexicon of Jewish history. Durban was an inflection point. And I'm not sure that we all understood then, but from the perspective of 2021, Howard, intersectionality, which has become a buzzword of the anti-Israel movement in the United States and elsewhere, in a way, for me, was born out of what we saw at Durban. And then to fast forward, Howard, one final point. In my view, for those of us who engage in non-governmental diplomacy as we do here, it is impossible for governments to have it both ways. Meaning, on the one hand, to continue to support the memory of Durban, in this case, here in New York in a couple of weeks. And on the other hand, profess every January 27th on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, their tears, their grief, their sadness. My belief is that mourning dead Jews is obviously appropriate and necessary for all of us, but no less important is supporting living Jews. And we are calling out governments that profess, even adopting the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Yet when it comes to issues like this, sacrifice principle on the altar of political expediency. And we, at least, to the best of our ability, are not going to let them get away with it.
So, David, let's ask the question. There's a recent book called Jews Don't Count, that in fact you can be racist against anyone and get called out and persecuted and prosecuted for that. But when you're racist towards Jews, Jews don't count. Why are we seeing that in the world today? Why are we not able to stand up against racism when racism is directed against us? Why are we not finding friends out there? Why is there not a huge groundswell out there against the sort of racism? I saw recently that within the United States, of all hate crimes in the last year, 52% were in fact directed specifically at Jews.
I don't have a 280 character response for you, Howard. I'd have a 280 page response for you, but that would not go well for this conference. I understand. But number one, allow me just to make one correction. According to the FBI report that was just issued, 58.5% of all religiously motivated hate crimes in the United States were targeted at Jews, who comprised roughly 2% of the population. So approximately a factor of 30 times more than our actual population. But with respect to overall hate crimes, African Americans and Asian Americans were principal targets as well. I can't give you a one-size-fits-all answer to the question, but clearly there is a hierarchy of racism, if you will, or victimization. Not just a competition over victimization, but a hierarchy. And again, depending on your lens, Jews, who are seen by many as white, irrespective of the realities of Israeli demography or our indigenous roots, we are seen as white, we are seen as powerful, we are seen as influential, we are seen as wealthy, we are seen as successful. And in the world of intersectionality, all of those words, all of those concepts have very negative connotations. Now, I layer that, Howard, on top of the long history of anti-Semitism, which has this unique ability, irrespective of facts or reason or rationality, to come up with both new versions and to sort of reignite old versions of anti-Semitism. In other words, to say that we can't pinpoint one reason and then go to the political equivalent of Moderna or Pfizer and say, well, we now know exactly what the problem is, find the vaccine. The problem is that we have more mutations than the Greek alphabet has letters. So Durban exposed it. Again, Durban exposed this, in particular, I believe, this bizarre, as the Brits call it, red-green alliance. This very unusual link between jihadists and the far left. I say bizarre because while some might try to rationalize it, needless to say, were the jihadists ever to be in control, among their first targets would be the far left and all the sort of core values of the far left. But be that as it may, I'm here to report, not to psychoanalyze. But I think that's a big part of it. And Israel, which is always at the center of this discussion, is seen as again, the expression of Jewish power, of Jewish success. It also conjures up the conspiracy theories of how could this small nation of 650,000 Tova in the era of the Yishuv have somehow managed to defeat the mighty Arab Islamic world. By the way, I would add, 3 years after Jews in their minds were led like sheep to slaughter by the Third Reich. So in order for that to happen, one has to attribute conspiratorial, evil, theories as well to notions of Jewish power, malevolence, in order to help explain this, because rationally it cannot be explained in that world. It cannot be explained.
So Mary, let's talk about the impact that Durban has had on the South African Jewish community. You know, it seems to be almost within South Africa, the smoke screen that people can say anything they want about Israel, about Zionists, about Jews, and then add on, but I'm not an anti-Semite, and we must remember the Holocaust. And somehow that justifies some of the worst racism that we actually have within our society. Tell us about how Durban impacted on our community.
Has impacted enormously, and you've explained it perfectly, Howard. It's as we always say, is if you don't have to hate Jews anymore. You can hate Israel, and then you can hate. That means you can hate Jews for free. You just say no, I hate Israel, or Israel is doing all sorts of things that are wrong, but it's got nothing to do with Jews. And we've had many court cases, sadly, that have reached our court, and we have one now at the Constitutional Court dealing with this exact issue. That if you call out and you make wild statements in public about coming to kill Zionists, you don't mean Jews. We've been able to, through the courts, explain that in fact, that's exactly who you mean. And that's had an impact on so much of how anti-Semitism is packaged. And we believe that the South African experience has been ground zero for this analogy of Israel as apartheid and Zionism is racism. And tonight it's been confirmed for us through the experience of the Durban conference. It gave rise to a whole new experience that has manifested in South Africa and has been propagated in many, many other countries around the world, and continues to be a very, very difficult experience for South Africans. Because if Israel is apartheid, then we as Jews and white South African Jews are explicit in that crime. So it's a really, really painful analogy. It's been a painful experience for us. But through the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, I'm proud to say that we fight it tooth and nail and leave no stone unturned, literally, to challenge any form of these accusations. But to say that it's easy would be a lie. It's tough.
Ahmed Shahid, you've been waiting patiently while we've had this conversation. You've, I'm sure, heard this trauma before. This isn't the first time. And you, of course, are United Nations Special Rapporteur when it comes to issues of religion and belief. Our community in South Africa feels traumatized. The world jury seems traumatized. Do you think there's any sense within the United Nations about the damage that Durban 1, 2, and 3 has done to both the cause of human rights and to the impact that it's had on the Jewish community?
Thank you, Howard. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel discussion with such a distinguished set of panelists here. The short answer, Howard, is no. I say this because clearly, you know, the Durban series is the wrong trend on the wrong tracks, because we saw that if it is about fighting racism, then it actually is one that's propagating a form of racism. Therefore, it certainly is, you know, going the wrong way. But what surprised me, having heard all these testimonies of the past few years I've been working in this space, is how little these concerns actually understood or appreciated by the wider UN membership. Of course, some countries do. We see repeatedly some countries not participate in the Durban forums, but others are oblivious to the kinds of concerns that Jewish communities have and their friends have. What went down in Durban 20 years ago, and the damage it causes continuously. And what surprises me today is that today we're saying that combating racism, combating hatred, combating intolerance is a top priority for the United Nations. We see the UN Secretary General have a global strategy to combat hatred. And of course, now we convene in this meeting in a few weeks' time in New York, and we've seen, as in previous times, a surefire way to escalate that hatred, a surefire way to renew that hatred. And we see that happening all the time. And as David was saying, you know, this meeting is taking place at a very disturbing time. From April onwards, we've seen another escalation. I've been saying every year, you know, this year is worse than last year. And of course, I would say from April this year, it's been a lot worse than what I observed even following the pandemic. So this intersectional narrative, you know, if you look at the statements that came out of the UN at the time, it seemed to be grounded in the argument that Israel is a modern, powerful state, and that it pitched against Israel are whatever, helpless, other people. So that imbalance equation has been created to demonize Israel. So what I've been saying is that, you know, to go ahead with this conference would deny what UN has been saying its aims are. What I mean by that is UN has recently appointed a focal point to look at anti-Semitism and coordinate efforts in this area. His action plan has in fact stated that they should oppose the use of UN mechanisms, UN architecture, UN structures to propagate anti-Semitism. And of course, this conference just keeps on doing that. I have been saying within the UN framework, asking countries to adopt the IHRA working definition, which is clear. If you adopt the working definition, then you can't have the Durban process continue, because the Durban process actually is very much designed to call, to treat Israel as if you like, the pariah state, the only state mentioned in the declaration and the induction plan, and done so in a way that categorically calls it a racist state. And that is something UN has has, revoked, having initially made that claim in 1975, 1991, it revoked that claim. So now we're going back to that. So I think it doesn't make sense at all. I come from the Maldives, and in my country, there's a saying that when you construct a building, if you lay the foundation crookedly, no matter how tall it is a building, to remain crooked. And same with Durban. And it does no service occupants of a building if you by building more and more in the structure. So I think we do a disservice, not just to Jews by carrying on with this process, but also to others who genuinely seek redress for racism, all forms of racism. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement really take on, and the need to address that is urgent, but we're not doing that anything helpful by bringing along, more racism, more hatred, and more vicious stuff into this space. So I think the task ahead of me, and I think ahead of all of us, is to see how we can prevent a Durban 5, at least in the from that Felice said, carry on combating racism, but disconnect with the Durban process, disconnect with the Durban framework from 20 years ago. I think we need to do more work on that. We now have more resources than before. By we, I mean the UN member states. We have more countries with envoys on combating anti-Semitism. We have more envoys looking at anti-racism issues. So I think we need to do that. And the task for me is to really clarify to everybody precisely what is so wrong with the Durban process. What is wrong with those paragraphs in the declaration, its placement, its content, and what it all adds up to. I think we need to do more of that and persuade more states to adopt that. I think we have to prevent the Gaddafis, the Castros, and the Ahmadinejads from hosting the next one. Thank you.
So I mean, if I, for example, am a Uyghur Muslim in China, I would expect to be top of the agenda. If I'm a Rohingya Muslim in Myanmar, I want to be top of the agenda. If I am, for example, a Baha'i in Iran, I want to be top of the agenda. If I'm a Hindu in Afghanistan and I've had my Buddhas blown up, or Buddhists in Afghanistan, I want to be top of the agenda. We're denying victimhood to victims and not providing them an opportunity. And that's one of the great tragedies that has come out of the Durban process. In the same way, within South Africa, we deny the victimhood of apartheid victims by stealing the term of apartheid and applying it to other things. And now we've got vaccine apartheid and Israeli apartheid, and the people who had their lives destroyed, who had their families separated, who are deprived of land, who are murdered by an abusive racist regime, are deprived of the victimhood. So how, in fact, do we give and allow the victims a voice again? And we're heading to Durban 4. It's scheduled for New York for the 21st. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's actually Sukkot. So I imagine most of the Jewish organizations won't be participating. But how do we make sure that Durban 4 actually addresses the real issues of racism? How do we make sure the real victims are actually heard and this process isn't hijacked again?
I think the first point to note there is that, of course, we should prioritize talking about the Uyghurs, the Rohingya, Kurdistan, right, and the Hazaras and the Sikhs, and so on and so forth. But Israel doesn't belong to any of these categories that we have just discussed here. It should not be part of the discussion at all. But instead of bringing these issues up there, they've done that. Now, I should point out that the next PGA for the UN, the person chairing this conference, is one of my compatriots from the Maldives. I think Erwin has friends in the Maldives, and others would have. I think we could make a pitch to make sure that perhaps, when states use that platform to, again, propagate anti-Semitism, that the chair calls out against this, or in other ways highlight the concerns that should be addressed. But the key thing is to recognize that we cannot actually fix the Durban process. We have to disconnect it, as Felice said, and find new language. So long as those paragraphs that characterize Israel as a racist state, either directly or indirectly, calls upon measures that will aim at destroying Israel as a state, so long as these remain in that framework, that's a toxic framework. It doesn't help anyone. So we have to go beyond that, go separate that out and find a new framework whereby we prioritize the kinds of concerns you just mentioned, Howard, about the Uyghurs, about the Rohingya, about the Hazaras, about the Yazidis, about others who are actually really facing real time, real challenges to their situation. And of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, the issues of xenophobia and migration, all of that, the real issues to be addressed here, and not singling out Israel and bashing Israel just because you can.
So, Erwin, who's going and who's boycotting? What's going to happen at Durban 4 in New York on the 21st?
Well, a number of people on this call are engaged in trying to persuade, the community of democracies, if I can use that term, not to go to Durban, because going to a Durban 4 really validates the hateful legacy of Durban. So I think it's important that we continue that process. I would hope also that the UN, because it's got its action plan now with respect to combating racism and hate, would also weigh in on this. And I want to commend Ahmed Shahid because he has been a singular, courageous and inspirational voice in the struggle against anti-Semitism. And he's made some very important points that I think should guide us in all of this. And that is that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies, so that it undermines, our democratic values. And it is an assault on our common humanity. In a word, it's the canary in the mineshaft of global evil. And Durban was the canary then, back in 2001. And we should not be allowing that legacy of hate to continue to be institutionalized and metastasized. So we have to both unmask and expose, as we are doing, what happened at Durban, because there are a lot of people that don't know really what happened at Durban. Number two, we have to continue to mobilize the community of democracies. Number three, I hope that the UN will weigh in on this. And number four, we have to realize also that Jews alone cannot combat, let alone defeat anti-Semitism. And so we really need to mobilize a kind of global constituency of conscience. And the Canadian government gave a good example recently in holding, and it became the first country to hold a national emergency summit to combat anti-Semitism, with the presence of the Prime Minister, 10 government ministers, parliamentarians, civil society leaders, diverse representation of the Jewish community. The whole idea here was to say that the combating of anti-Semitism is everyone's individual and collective responsibility. And that's why I think we need to mobilize this constituency of conscience. And Ahmed Shahid is at the forefront of this.
Howard,
David Harris, tell us, before you make that comment, tell us who's out, who's boycotting the conference, because we've seen kind of many of the Western nations saying we won't be party to this.
Right. So as of today, by our count, Howard, 12 nations have publicly declared that they will not be attending at any level. By the way, it's important to stress that, Howard, at any level. They are Australia, Austria, Bulgaria, Canada, Czech Republic, France, Germany, Hungary, surprise of surprises, Israel, Netherlands, the United States, and the United Kingdom. In addition, Howard, we know of 2 other countries, European countries, one EU, one non-EU, that have made a decision, and that decision is expected to be announced publicly. That brings us to 14 altogether, of which, by our count, 8 would be EU member states. Our work is still cut out for us, to Erwin's point. 19 EU member states, by our count, have still not made any indication that they will skip the conference, which Ahmed and Erwin and Felice and others have said needs to be disconnected from the legitimate struggle for racism. 19 EU member states, all of which profess to be staunchly opposed to anti-Semitism in all of its forms, and yet when push comes to shove, they're willing to compromise. That's our target audience right now, those 19 member states.
So, Mark Pozniak, let's ask about South Africa. South Africa is definitely going, I presume. It's a lost cause. Is there any point in our community getting involved in trying to pressurize our government at all? Or are we so down the rabbit hole in this country that there's no hope?
Good God, Howard. I don't think we should ever profess to say that there's no hope. I do think that we have our hands full, and I think we have a particular struggle on our hands. And I think the important thing to note is that we're tackling that struggle bit by bit. I think we win some and we lose some. I don't think that we should be deciding what's achievable or not achievable. But I do think that in the pantheon of challenges that this country faces, the reality of the situation is that Israel, I think Israel very often becomes a political football that's usable and an easy target, that gets played around at levels that's hiding other issues. But I think for us, we have to remain focused, and I think we have to remain engaged, and that's the important thing. And I think the Jewish Board of Deputies ensures that where we see anti-Semitism, we fight anti-Semitism, that there is a consequence for anti-Semitism in South Africa. It is not easy to be an anti-Semite in South Africa. And that is the fight that we will take to the streets, and we will take to the courts, and we will take wherever it needs to happen. But we have to, over and above that, continue to engage. And through those engagements, which happen, we hope to have influence. We'll have good days and we'll have not so good days. Is what it is.
So before I ask all our panelists to leave us with one last thought each, I just want to say a huge thank you to Wendy Kahn, who has driven this process, helped to put this panel together, has managed to recruit a remarkable panel from around the world. It is such a great privilege to work with Wendy and to partner with the South African Jewish Board of Deputies in order to do this and to allow the thousands of people who watched us tonight to really participate in this process, to learn what happened at Durban, but more importantly, to actually understand how we go further. It's also been so amazing to have people like Douglas Gibson, one of our most famous members of Parliament of all times, on the webinar tonight and commenting so often. So Wendy, a huge thank you to you. Enormously grateful for all the hard work and effort that you put in making sure that tonight happened. And if I could just ask if we could go around, maybe starting first with Felice, to leave us with one last quick thought about the way forward.
I'm going to repeat what I said before. The veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians, and we must never rest, as Tom Lantos said, and that our message is root out racism, but disconnect from Durban.
Professor Owen Kotler?
I think we should try to encourage countries to develop a national action plan to combat anti-Semitism, to implement it, and to make the enhancement and implementation of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism a central theme for it.
David Harris?
2 quick thoughts. The era of Jews with trembling knees is over. We are Jews, we stand tall, we are proud, and we will not back off. And number 2, we will not be denied our place in the struggle against racism and racial discrimination, nor will we allow others to hijack that struggle in the name of racism. We will find our ways to continue to stand tall on behalf of anti-racism and racial discrimination.
Tova Herzl?
Pursuant to what people said about standing tall and so on, I think an evening like this with a discussion like this are very, very important in making sure that people remain aware and alert and go forward in the most appropriate and proud way.
Ahmed Shahid?
All of the above, and I would add, engage with the youth globally, and build new and unusual relationships. Thank you.
So I have left the 4 South Africans till last. So Mary Klug.
Thank you, Howard. I think going forward for me is when I look at the illustrious panel that has joined us this evening, and I think about how in Jewish leadership, we are a force where we have incredible support and a network across the globe. Standing tall is not hard. We are working as a formidable team. And I'm very proud to be part of it. Thank you so much. And thank you for this evening to everybody.
Tamar Lazarus, allow the thoughts of your Durban past to pass and look towards a Durban future.
It is, you look back and you look forward, and we look back at Durban, where we came from, and the amazing team and people that were together, that we experienced together, that experience, and look forward. And as everybody say, educate, be involved, continue to hold that T-shirt high, wear it proudly with a Magen David on it. I still have it. I have it here too. Yes, and be proud Zionist and proud Jews. And we have so much to offer our community, the world.
Mark
Thank
Pozniak, your closing thoughts?
Thanks. I'll just go after everybody. Thanks, Howard.
Well, not really. No, Wendy's going to have the last word here.
And so she should, No, I think, I think to build on what Mary has said, going back to Durban in my mind, something that I learned seeing Peleg in that foyer of that hotel was that as long as there is a Jew anywhere in the world near you, you are not alone. And the greatness of our people, and we see it in the fight and the courage of the work that's being done by the people on this panel and the organizations that we work with around the world. It's a true privilege, I find, to be a part of this nation. But Durban taught me that greatness has to exist just a little bit because of me and not just for me. And I think that if, I have young children, I focus every day, well, not every day, but I try to ensure that if they understand that their job is to find a way, some way, any way, it doesn't have to be a big way, it could be a small way, to take a little less than they give to not just, not just the people of Israel or the nation of the Jews, but to humanity, then we'll be better off for it. And I think if we can all find a little way, we try.
Wendy Kahn, given all your hard work and effort in putting tonight together, the final word has to be yours.
Thank you so much, Howard, and thank you so much for hosting this, because we brought together such remarkable people from around the world, but I think you really pulled it together so brilliantly. And thank you so much for drawing all the wisdom out of these people. And I just want to thank everybody so much, from all corners of the earth, for making the time to be with us in South Africa tonight. Durban has got a particular resonance for the people who live in this country. And it's been so special for us to be able to commemorate it together with friends from around the world. I wasn't in Durban in 2001, but I was in 2009 at the conference in Geneva, Durban 2. And I think what was so inspiring about Durban 2 was that global Jewry had learnt its lesson by then. And we all worked so brilliantly together. Diaspora Jewry, Israelis. I remember staying in the hotel with the Jewish caucus, and it was one of the most uplifting experiences. Mark was with me, one of the most uplifting experiences of my life. And I think that's what the issue is that we learned from the experience and we did things differently. differently. And in South Africa, we do things differently. We don't accept this kind of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-Jewish hatred. And I'm very proud of our organizations in South Africa. We stand up to any form of hatred. It's not easy sometimes. We've managed to turn our campuses around from places that were horrific hatred during particularly Israel apartheid weeks. We've managed to turn that around into celebration of Israeli diversity. And we can turn these things around, and we have to turn these things around. And thank you so much to our partners from around the world for joining us in that fight. Shana Tova.
So we